today. But as you can see, the title of my presentation is Founding Stories and Funding Glories, kind of Pathways to the Valley of Death. Why did I pick that title? One, I love things that rhyme, of course. But also, I think it illustrates some of the things we were getting into up here already, and illustrates some of the key issues that face all of us that are trying to make innovations in public health, but also those of us who are trying to be social innovators in other ways as well. So when you look at it, as you're trying to raise funds, which seems to be a very important topic for our fledgling social entrepreneurs, you have two assets in your corner usually as you start. You have your founding story. This is the inspiration behind everything, the thing that you're going to lead with most often when you're out there presenting, when you're talking to people. And it also is the thing that actually drives the entire vision of what you're trying to do. And then you have your sales pitch or your narrative. So these are two things that are your key assets. But what I want to warn you about, as many of you already know, these can also be your downfall. So let me take you through one of my assets, which is the founding story of Ubuntu Education Fund. So Jacob Leaf, who you see here up on the screen, grew up in New Jersey. When he was in high school, he moved to London. And when he got there, he was out in Hyde Park and he saw these rallies going on. And they were anti-apartheid movement rallies. And he saw this and he couldn't believe that at this time in history, we were still fighting against a government that was basically imposing slavery. It changed his mind completely about the way he saw the world, and he was passionate about getting to South Africa. He was able to help construct a trip through his high school in London to go visit South Africa and explore, in 1994, this incredible transition to democracy. They went there, they started visiting with all different kinds of people in the country. They met with everyone from African National Congress freedom fighters to neo-Nazis to understand what this incredible dynamic that was going on in this new South Africa. So Jake always tells this story as he was going through South Africa. He was in a township in the shadows of Sandton in Johannesburg. Now, if you can picture this, and some of you have been to South Africa, you're standing at literally the economic hub of South Africa. Skyscrapers, like you'll see in New York. Right next to it, aluminum shacks. The most incredible poverty you've ever witnessed, right next to each other, literally in the shadows. And he sees these lines snaking through the townships, people waiting to vote. So as I was said, they were talking to people to understand. And he walked up to an elderly woman who was standing in one of these lines. And he said to her, "How long have you been here?" And she said, "I've been in line for 24 hours. He said, "You've been waiting 24 hours to vote?" And she looked at him and she said, "No, boy, I've been waiting 85 years to vote." So for someone who grew up like many of us did, who never faced that kind of hardship, this was a life-changing moment. And he ended up going back to the United States for university. And in 1999, he found a way to get a job in Cape Town as a study abroad. But this was 1999, and the internet was a fledgling concept, and as Jake likes to say, he was one of the first people to be scammed by the internet. And he got there, and there was no job, and there was no organization that was truly making a difference on the ground. And he met a black South African who said to him, "Well, if you want to see how I live and how I've lived, and you want to see how the majority of people here live, come with me to Port Elizabeth, South Africa." So they took a train across the country. He went to this township, and they were wandering around the township, seeing the scars of apartheid, seeing the horrors that were left behind by this institution of slavery. But eventually they got thirsty, so they needed to stop off at a shebeen, which is a township bar. And they walked in, and as you can imagine, this young, long-haired kid in a completely black township the record basically stopped, and everybody looked at him. One man, this guy Banks, motioned him over, said, "Come have a drink with me." Wanted to know what this kid was doing in these townships. And he said, "I'm here because I want to help." Banks said, "Well, I've been a teacher in these communities for 20 years. I've been doing programs after school. I've been trying to help. I would love your help." Jake said, "Great. I just need a place to stay." That night, Jacob moved in with Banks' family in the townships in his apartment, much to the chagrin of Banks' girlfriend. And they started this thing, and they started it in the broom closet of Banks' school. So fast forward 17 years later, the vision of these two men in a broom closet has turned into what we think is a world-class development model, serving over 2,000 children and their family, taking orphaned and vulnerable children from cradle to career. And as I said, it's been going on 17 years. We employ over 70 people in the township, locally. Okay, so that's our founding story. So, who am I? I've known Jake since I was 3 years old. And when he went off to London, we kept in touch. We were very, very close. And he started telling me a few things about what he was getting into, but I couldn't really follow it. And I got to university, and I was in university, and all of a sudden, I got a letter in the mail, more than one. And I opened them up, and I started reading them. And Jacob was in a country, I didn't even realize he was in South Africa. And I'm reading about him living in this man's house, working in his school, where there's 50 children in a classroom, girls are raped and abused regularly, people are living in the most extreme poverty you can imagine. And I couldn't believe how my friend's mind had changed and what was important to him now, growing up mostly worrying about the Mets. And now, having this vision and mission in life, and just reading those letters was starting to change my mind. So fast forward a little bit in my life, a few years later, after university, Jake reached out for a favor. He had just started raising enough money to build upon the fundraising foundation, some of the stages we were talking about up here earlier. And he needed someone to help. And he couldn't pay anything. So for basically a spot in his couch and some beers at the end of the week, I went in and started fundraising with Jacob in an office in the back of Hoboken, New Jersey. Now, I couldn't pronounce Ubuntu. I'd never been to South Africa, and I'm going to be honest with you, I didn't know that much about it. But I'm out there selling tickets to small plays and things like that. And about 6 months in, of course, Jake says to me, "Oh, by the way, I'm going back to South Africa." So all of a sudden, I'm an executive. And I think under the circumstances, I did pretty well. But at the end of that year, I said to Jake, "All right, that was cool. I want to go to South Africa." And of course, Jake said no, because we hire locally. And he didn't need to employ his buddy from New Jersey. I understood, went off to London, got a master's degree, finished up, started looking for jobs. And while I was doing it, I thought, you know what? Let me just ping Jake real quick and make sure he still doesn't need me. So he said, "You know what? There is something. We've started the strategic planning process in South Africa. I would love you to sort of come down and volunteer and consult." So it was basically a project to build capacity locally so that the program could be run independently. And I went down with a commitment to do this 6-month project, and it ended up taking about 10 years. So I ended up living in Port Elizabeth for the next 10 years in South Africa and helping to build this model that I'm really proud of. But if we look at the narrative, so those are our stories. And those are our powerful assets we have. But now let's look at the narrative that's the bigger narrative over time at Ubuntu. If we look, and this is, as you will see, many organizations have those first 5 years. Now I've broken it down into 5-year segments. Those first 5 years, you're looking at that foundation, that founding story time, where that's what you got. You're running around. You're telling the stories I just told, and you're trying to inspire people. You don't necessarily know what you're doing, right? but you get through it and you figure it out. And we were lucky enough and maybe tenacious enough to get through it. And then you might hit a period of accelerated growth where you get to start building your dreams and all the things these incredible entrepreneurs are dreaming about. Maybe a school in Kenya. You build it and you get that growth. And then for us, what happened, and luckily enough, is we're able to stabilize and really build out our model and focus on quality. And now we're in a period of sort of expansion and another bold vision that I'm happy to talk about offline. But when you then superimpose the funding and how it works on top of those 5-year periods, you're looking at a beginning where, as we articulated here, you're scrambling, you're getting those small donations, you get a few angel donors, and you make it through. But then the scary part comes for me, and this is maybe where there's a lesson learned, and maybe where we can learn how to avoid empty rhetoric, as we're trying to do in this segment. You start maybe bringing in what I would call bad money. Okay? So the founding story can be dangerous because you may not know exactly what you're pitching for, and you might start taking certain things. But the other thing is the business plan that we talked about up here. Are you driving the money that's coming into you, or is it driving you? And probably the best way to avoid going from rhetoric to impact, or to go from rhetoric to impact, is to avoid the rhetoric altogether. The empty rhetoric I'm talking about, by never accepting a direction in your organization that isn't completely true to your mission. Unfortunately, that's not what happened at Ubuntu. We started getting all this, what we called later, drug money. It was sexy, but it was like a dangerous cocktail. All of a sudden you're spinning out of control, and you're doing things that you didn't intend to do, and your budget's bigger, but you're not having a bigger impact. And the money, cents on the dollar, is not worth what it says on the check that you receive, because you're out there doing things that somebody else wants you to do, priorities that may be developed in Washington or somewhere in Europe, and they're not necessarily what you meant to do. Luckily, we went to rehab, so to speak. Or maybe we were on a diet, whatever you want to call it. We cut it, and it was hard. And it was brutal, but we cut it. We stopped going after it to a certain extent. And we got out of it. And that's how we reached our period of stability, and that's how we want to go forward in terms of how we look at continuing to seek impact over rhetoric. This is the Ubuntu Center. So for all the advice I've given about maybe staying small, we went big. And what we did was we built a $7 million building in the middle of one of the poorest places in South Africa. And we did it because it embodies hope. But more importantly, for what I'm talking about today, it embodies our vision. It embodies the local feedback and the local needs and desires that were truly there. And it's about quality over quantity. And we realized what we were was about depth over breadth. This was the way we were going to be able to help children in this community go from, as we sort of say, cradle from career or womb to work, all the way through long term. And we weren't driven by how many children we could reach, which was where the funding was going. We were driven by how deeply we could reach each child. We decided to invest deeply instead of investing broadly. And we laid out a business plan that we were able to go to funders with and drive that towards impact. And we were no longer selling what I would consider as sort of empty rhetoric. We were creating a vision of impact, and then it was easy to sell. That's when we were able to develop our approach. That's when we were able to take the local knowledge and develop a comprehensive, deep approach to what we believe is necessary to raising a child. What we looked at was actually what got all of us here. It wasn't one cup of soup, right? It wasn't a wind-up computer by itself. There are many different types of effective interventions, but we realized in our context for what we could do, they had to be combined. And this was not something that a donor told us to do, and it is not something that appealed at the beginning to many donors, and it's a long-term process. It's not the sexiest thing. I can't tell you that I saved a life with $5, and I can't tell you that I saved a life in a year. I mean, how many lives get saved in the average grant cycle? Not many. But people want you to tell you it is. But we had to start fighting back and staying true to what we were, and it's not the most effective rhetoric, but it started to inspire a passion in us where we're able to articulate something important. So when we look at rhetoric, and we define if we're supposed to be moving from rhetoric to impact, when we look at the definition of rhetoric, it's basically persuasive or effective language that is able to convince people. And the truth is that we all need that. The end of the definition is it's usually found to be or perceived to be meaningless or without substance. The thing about rhetoric is we want to develop this persuasive language. And the key is not completely avoiding rhetoric, but rather studying the relationship between rhetoric and impact and which drives which. If you're out there and you find yourself with persuasive language that feels empty to you, that is probably the problem. But if you're out there making an impact and it's driving you to be able to sell it persuasively, then I think we can all agree that that is the best way to redefine our sector. Thank you.